Hi guys, welcome to Olympic Weightlifting for Sports Performance. Okay, so today we're going to go through a few different things in regards to weightlifting or Olympic weightlifting and how it pertains to sports performance. Specifically, what we're going to have a look at is the fundamentals of Olympic lifting. So what makes up the sport and the training elements and what they actually do, and then how that relates to sport. We're going to have a look at the movement analysis of both the snatch and the clean and jerk. We're going to break down the five main phases of weightlifting, which apply to both of the main lifts. We're going to have a look at applying the weightlifting to sports performance environments and have a look down at which phases of weightlifting sort of pertain to which phases of sports training. And we're also going to have a quick look at programming and progressing the weightlifting movements. So to give you a bit of an understanding, the fundamentals of weightlifting, there's sort of two main things we're looking at here is why do we do it? And the reason for that is really quite simple, is we're trying to increase the power output of our athletes. So specifically, we're trying to increase the power production through weighted explosive exercises, obviously using the barbell as our tool. We're looking at developing speed strength qualities, and also we'll get some strength speed qualities. And what this will help create is essentially what we commonly more refer to as power or power development in athletes. Essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to create the greatest amount of force in the shortest possible time. So if we're moving slightly fast with a lighter weight, that's fine. If we're moving fast with heavy weights than we have previously, that's also going to see an increase in power, and that's using our basic calculation of force times velocity equals power. The other thing we're going to look at is where does it fit in the periodization model or the training plan. Weightlifting as a tool is sport specific, and it's generally the transition into competitive phases. It can absolutely be included in preparatory periods for sports, but this will be more of a skill development phase or a natural application, maturation with that. If they've done it for a few years, then absolutely we can still use it in preparatory phase, but it will be more general conditioning. So they maintain the quality, whilst as we transition into specific phases and competitive phases, it will become the primary tool. The technique is obviously the highest priority. It's a skill-based movement, so we really put our emphasis on that, on the skill side of things, because quite simply, if we don't, we're not going to move in a way that's going to elicit a physiological adaptation to the body. Novice lifters should begin with dowels or unloaded bar weight, and this allows them to really understand the skill and the motor demand before we add the complexity of load. As I mentioned, it can be completed all year as long as the focus of the implementation of it changes. So obviously in season we can't lift as much or as frequently, so the Olympic lifts provide a lot of bang for buck. In the off season, we're trying to tick off and continue to expose our athletes to as much as possible. However, we still want to maintain the quality, so we have to factor that in as well. There's a bit of a general overview in terms of how we implement it. So just breaking down the variations and creating some really clear definitions. So for the clean, there are four main variations. So the floor clean, which is a clean executed from the ground into a full catch position, and a front squat. The hang full clean is the same thing, but starting from the knee position. The floor power clean, like the floor clean, starts from the ground but finishes in the power position or a quarter squat stance. And the hang power clean, which is probably the one you guys will see the most of, is commencing from the knee position and finishing in the quarter squat position. The same thing applies for the snatch. So floor snatch and floor power snatch are both completed from the ground, with the floor power snatch finishing in a quarter squat overhead posture. The floor snatch, as shown in the picture on the right, is a full snatch and catch in the overhead squat position. And the hang power snatch will be conducted from the hang position at the knees. The jerk, there are three main variations we look at. So the push press, which is a dip, drive, and catch without the knee dipping again. The power jerk is a dip in the knee, a extension, and then catching in a dip position. The split jerk is the same, but you are catching in a split stance or a split lunge position. There are four main squats that have varied throughout Olympic lifting variations, and they include the front squat, the back squat, which is used more from a training perspective, or preparation for a snatch balance. A snatch balance is with the bar behind the neck, and essentially performing a snatch jerk and catching in the overhead squat position. And then we have the overhead squat position, which is again demonstrated. Now we'll go through practical breakdowns of this as well. Sometimes you'll see there are some slight variations with how people categorize this, but overall it's pretty common. So we'll try and just create some standardized comparisons with these movements along with what they look like in reality. So there's three main things we need to look at when we're implementing weightlifting. And they are, how do we teach the movements? How do we teach the complexes of these movements? So how do we break it down and work out how can we break down a movement that requires multiple skills within it and make it achievable? So how we chain the order of progressions and add layer upon layer before to allow them to complete the full movements. We have to look at what are the requirements. So what are the basic mobility and stability demands? What are the basic strength demands before they complete certain variations of the lifts? And we have to understand and be able to analyze the movement, understand what is acceptable standards of patterns, what are we wanting them to achieve and where we want them to get to. So having a model of movement that we can sort of quantify or measure in terms of what we expect them to achieve, that's a really key thing of what we want to look at. So looking at the chaining of movements. So basically we're starting from the ground. Now in this example, we're going to break down both the clean and snatch at the same time. As for the majority of it, the chaining of the movements is the same. The main difference is the grip. So for the snatch, they're going to have a wide grip. And for the clean, they're going to have a front squat grip or just outside shoulder width. So the first phase is the deadlift. So starting with a dead weight from the ground, they'll move into a mid-thigh pull, essentially perform an upright row followed by a shrug pull. A high pull will occur next, and then the front squat or overhead, followed by, overhead squat for the snatch and front squat for the clean. And then for the push press and the split lunge, that will be the patterns that occur for the clean movement only. So if I have a look at the snatch, we can see wide grip deadlift position, quite upright. And then as they transition into the hang position, they start to get more horizontal with their hip posture. Their shoulders remain over the bar, so their center of mass is staying in the vertical pattern. As they transition towards the mid-thigh, the hips start to extend up vertically. We can then see them transition into the pulling phase and essentially peeling the bar up their body into an overhead posture and catching in the overhead squat. For the clean and jerk, very similar. We just changed to the clean grip, starting with the deadlift weight. Notice that the shoulders and the center of mass remain slightly over the bar. It's a more vertical pattern than our traditional deadlifting position. As they transition into the hang position, you can see that the hips remain quite horizontal. They start to move vertically with the shoulders remaining still over the bar. And it's not until the hips fully extend that now the shoulders are behind the bar. And the reason for that is that's a bar path. That's the area we're trying to move the bar path into now. If you're looking side on, you'll see, and I've got a video I'll send to you guys with this, the bar path stays completely vertical and the body moves around the bar. So as they transition to the high pull phase now, their arms drop underneath it in a C-shaped formation and they'll sit down to the front squat. So their body's moving around the bar. Once they stand from the front squat, we can see they go into the push jerk phase, or in this case, a split jerk, where they dip into that push press posture with a slight quarter squat bend in the knee and hips, extend the bar directly overhead, and then catching in that quarter lunge position, and then performing the stance from there. So the 5 phases we want to look at. Phase 1 is our pulling phase, or the first pull, and that's going to start from the floor. So the barbell will move from the floor to the knee. Knee extension is followed by a small amount of hip extension. So the keys that we're looking for is the body remains in the same position as from start to end. The shoulders do not drop. The hip should not come up too early. So the bar is moving vertically, but the angles of the joints won't change too much here, apart from that knee extension. The second phase is the transition phase, or that what we refer to as the hang position. This is the point at which the barbell reaches the point below the ASIS into the power position. So from the knee to the ASIS, essentially. The bottom of the ASIS. The keys that we're looking for is the barbell should remain in a close proximity to the midline of the body. We don't want it to go away from the body. The torso needs to reach a vertical position at the top of the movement, and the shoulders should remain over the bar throughout the transition phase. The second pull is our power pull, and it's our third phase. This is where most of the forces develop, so this is where we get our hip extension bang for buck. It's a really key thing that we transition the momentum through our range of motion, so we're continuing to move the bar from the speed we generated from the initial pull. The critical element for this is the accuracy, coordination, and balance. The bar starts to move in a free weight position. So what I mean by that is the momentum generated from the initial pull and overcoming that inertia continues to provide momentum through this phase. So it's a real key that we're able to handle this high velocity movement and continue to generate momentum onto the bar. The keys that we want to focus on is the barbell momentum is heading upwards and not forwards. The barbell stays in close proximity to the body. Full extension of the hip, knee, and ankle starts to occur, and we drive the feet into the ground. So we want to think about pushing the ground away. The next phase, so the fourth phase, is our catch phase, the receiving position of the bar. This will occur in the front squat position for the clean and the overhead squat position for the snatch. It's the position where we're underneath the barbell. The key is for this is that we're moving relatively under load here. So the key is that our body needs to move faster than the gravity acting on the weights to lower down. So we need to move as quickly as possible. And it's really important that our timing is really spot on here. What we want to focus on, especially for the clean, is creating a C shape with our elbows as we swing through. For the overhead position, we're just focusing on remaining extended through the elbows, keeping an externally rotated posture through those elbows and shoulders. The feet want to be slightly outward to increase our base of support. So when we're taking the momentum of the weight dropping down, a wider squat stance or an externally rotated squat stance is going to be advantageous. And we want to think about pulling our hips underneath the bar as quickly as possible. The fifth phase, and the easiest of the 5 phases, is the recovery phase. And this is essentially just setting up with the bar from the squat position. So we're just performing the concentric element of the squat to remain in a finished position. There are 2 issues that can influence the recovery phase, and that is essentially insufficient leg strength quality. So this is when essentially our motor skill development for the clean or the snatch is ahead of our physiological leg strength qualities. This is a very rare thing. It doesn't happen too often. Generally, people will develop their muscular strength well ahead of their motor control for these lifts, but it can happen, especially with highly skillful motor processing people who have the ability to learn skills really quickly, can sometimes learn to handle more weight from a motor control perspective before they had the physiological strength. The second thing is they rush through the movement, causing instability. So if we rush the processes and lose our momentum or lose our control and our fluidity with the exercise, we can cause instability. And this essentially comes down to eccentric control. So our abilities to absorb forces aren't quite good. And an increase in instability will cause us to not be able to perform the recovery element of the movement. For the snatch, as I mentioned, it's the concentric portion of the overhead squat, and the clean will be the concentric portion of the front squat, so the finishing position. So moving on to sort of prescribing this, and after we've broken down the movements, there are 5 things we need to make sure that the athletes have before we apply them. And that is adequate mobility, stability, and coordination. So we need mobility to move the joints through adequate range of motion. We need to ensure there is stability there so they can control that range of motion. And we need to ensure there is coordination throughout the chaining and the processing of the movements. The second thing is we need to make sure they have the ability to perform the prerequisite lifts. So we need to make sure that they can floor pull, they can deadlift, they can RDL, they can upright row, they can overhead press, they can front squat, they can back squat. Making sure they have fundamental movements through here ensures us that they have some level of motor coordination in the lead up to going into these chained movements. And they also have a basic adequate level of strength and stability and mobility going into these progressions. We need to make sure once they have that, they have the ability to chain and transition through positions. So can they move from the floor to the hang to the power to the pull? And that's a really big thing we'll focus on in the coaching in terms of how we add the layers of that. And it's really simple. You start with one progression. So you start with prerequisite lift and you just start to train the transition. So a hang to a power to a pull, and etc. As I said, we need to make sure they have the ability to perform variation movements. So now we're starting to chain it. So hang pulls, snatch high pulls, floor pulls, etc., where they're starting to chain 2 or 3 of the phases together, and we can see progression in that. And then from there, we can have a look at programming Olympic lifts that are specific to their needs, okay, where they're at in their time of season and what the demand of their sport is. So a lot of athletes don't need to necessarily have the overhead work, and it's really the triple extension stuff we're looking at. So just catching positions and performing the extension positions are going to be really advantageous. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. Just to differentiate between sort of traditional and athletic development from weightlifting, when we're looking at traditional weightlifting, the main goal is to lift as much weight from the ground to the overhead position as possible. Guys, every athlete to lift from the ground and press overhead. And the sport essentially requires one component of training, and that really is the power development. So what's important to take out of this is that Olympic weightlifters are trained to do exactly that. They're trained to take the weight from the ground and place it overhead as quickly as possible and with as much load as possible. Whilst when we're looking at athletic development, the main goal is to develop explosive qualities specific to triple extension. The movements can be changed and broken down as required to develop specific athletic traits. And it's important to understand that the sport requires multiple components of training and should be carefully considered and implemented across macro, meso, and micro cycles. And what I mean by that is that when we're looking at sports and field-based and contact-based sports and running-based sports that really get benefits from elements of weightlifting, it's important to understand that there are so many other elements to that training model that are required for success in that sport, that specifically only looking at the traditional variants and constraints of weightlifting and applying that to an athletic development environment isn't going to hold up very well. So the key is to take away the important elements of weightlifting and find ways to apply that in an athletic environment that still direct results in the areas we want them to. And in this case, in an athletic environment, it's really about developing that power qualities, those speed strength qualities in those vertical triple extension patterns, which progress to our running and our jumping qualities. So having a look at how elements of the weightlifting variations apply to our sports setting, this is a really nice way to sort of categorize what we're doing and how it influences our athletic development. So our prerequisite lists work to develop basic fundamental strength, stability, and coordination, as I mentioned earlier. And this really acts as a foundation for us to build power qualities on top of. Our floor position variants work to develop starting force production, and they are strength dominant. So if we're trying to make things easier for an athlete and they're not super strong yet, adding in this element will make it slightly more challenging for them. So if we're trying to regress a movement, taking out the floor pull phase or the deadlifting phase is going to make the task a little bit simpler, but it does allow us to develop that strength dominance or that starting strength and braking inertia. So really good for acceleration qualities. Our hang position variance works to develop greater acceleration qualities due to its rapid elastic movement, so different to the floor position where we're coming over that starting inertia. This is causing us to use elastic or stretch shortening qualities where we're producing a dip and acceleration of movement. So if we think of the clean, we're starting from a tall position, a hang clean, and heading down to the knee quickly, creating a rapid eccentric movement and then extending rapidly concentric is going to help develop that acceleration, elastic qualities, explosive movements against momentum. Our pull variants work really well to develop optimum triple extension patterns, which really work well for our sprinting and jumping qualities. So that's where they become really handy. So things like our snatch high pulls, clean high pulls, etc., or even just clean shrugs where we're getting vertical extension are really awesome. And the last one is the catch variance. And a lot of people in strength conditioning will shy away from including catch variance, and they'll sort of suggest that, well, I get my triple extension patterns from my pull movements. I'm able to accumulate starting strength and acceleration from my floor and hang positions. But what I see with the catch variance is they're a really great way to develop force absorption qualities, especially the power catch position, because we're landing in that quarter squat position, which is really similar to how we land in landings from jumping sports. And it's just really similar to how we move in a lot of different sports. And so our ability to absorb force in that position is going to make it easier to then apply force in that position. If we think about a change of direction, it's all about decelerating and then re-accelerating. So the really cool thing I like about the force absorption qualities is I'm teaching them to absorb that force inexplicitly, where they're starting to develop unconscious motor patterns in these more advantageous positions. So as a bang for buck, if I'm completing the movement, it's definitely worthwhile for me to continue to teach those variations in the development phase so I can maintain those qualities in the training phases later on in their career. So looking specifically at the clean and snatch and what we're getting from sort of a bang for buck perspective. So we get great development of strength, speed, power, and speed strength. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at our force velocity curve. We're getting increased starting speed from the ground, and we're getting increased acceleration from the hang, and this pertains both to the clean and the snatch. They both work to develop rapid triple extension, which is really positive associated with our jumping qualities. It demands a high level of hip, ankle, and thoracic mobility, as well as core, ankle, and shoulder stability. So whilst I'm still getting these strength, speed, power qualities, I'm also getting a really great challenge and stimulus on mobility and stability, as well as muscle coordination. So when you look at it like that, okay, so I'm developing my key qualities in terms of strength, speed, power, speed, strength, acceleration, etc. But at the same time, I'm also able to stress the system in a really complex way that kicks off multiple movements and multiple fitness qualities and performance qualities. The jerk, being predominantly upper, works to develop the upper body strength and power. And it's a really great tool to transition upper body strength into upper body power and explosive movements. It also works from that force absorption quality I was speaking about earlier. And as I was saying just then with the clean and snatch, is it allows us to ensure that we're really getting something that challenges thoracic mobility and shoulder stability and integrity of the upper body as well, while still training those strength and power qualities. And so it's a really nice way to start to bring qualities together and apply them in the same task. A couple of key coaching things I want to focus on, and we can apply this when we're coaching it in the sessions, is that I like to teach from the hip down. So how that works is it creates a simple motor task for the athlete to learn at the start and allows simple progression as we work. So it's simply starting at, say, a power shrug, where we're just dipping to the mid-thigh position and extending up, and then slowly adding layers to the hang and eventually the floor, whilst also adding chain up. So if we start with a power shrug, we might then go to a power high pull, a hang shrug into a hang high pull. So we're starting to branch away from the center of the body as much as possible. A key thing I like to focus on as well is we want to dominate hip extension before progressing. And we want to make sure the hip extension is happening in a vertical progression. And this goes hand in hand with the teaching from the hips down. We're trying to teach the hip coordination, because this is what generates so much power for us. And if this is slightly off, any progression on other qualities away from that is not going to be as optimal unless we nail that hip extension first. Now, athletes don't need to be experts, they just need to be competent. So we need to teach them what they need. If there are athletes that don't need certain qualities of the Olympic lifts, then we don't need to teach them, and we don't need to have them perform in an expert standard. We do need to perform to a competent standard where that movement actually derives a physiological benefit. If they are not achieving hip extension, if they are banging up their wrists and shoulders, then I'm not competent. If I'm able to competently move the bar at a high velocity from my mid-shin or mid-thigh to my catch position, and I'm able to achieve hip extension, we can look at this through video analysis, then I know that I'm moving in a competent way. And we use those KPIs, which I mentioned earlier, of the 5 phases, to identify with our coaching eye, are they competent or not? We just need them to get to that competency level. There are multiple ways to teach and integrate these methods. We need to remain flexible and open-minded. So it's not necessarily that we might always use the barbell. There are different tools and different ways, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what I was saying earlier with the force velocity curve, we want to understand exactly, well, where does Olympic lifting fit and what qualities are we developing? And I've mentioned strength, speed, and speed strength earlier. So at the bottom of this, we've obviously got our velocity moving to the right and our force moving up. And so our maximal strength will be our traditional strength exercises, or in this case, it'll be our prerequisite lifts. So it's our deadlifts and it's our squats and it's our overhead presses, etc. Our strength speed is where we're starting to move similar weights to these as fast as possible. And that's generally our cleans. Between strength, speed, and speed strength qualities, we'll generally see power developed, and we can measure this through velocity as well. And our cleans will still work across there, and they'll still work down to speed strength depending on what loads we use and what speed we move at. but our snatch becomes a really good tool as well. So the snatch will fit in the power section as well, in between strength, speed, and speed, strength. And it can also be used in speed, strength phase. The reason I haven't mentioned it here is because in some cases, weighted jumps and medicine ball throws will probably be more advantageous for developing speed strength in most cases. And finally, for speed, it'll be bodyweight jumps and sprints. And so what I like about this example, it just gives us a breakdown of sort of where Olympic lifts fit into developing strength and power and speed, and what other tools fit on either side of that. So we know where we're progressing an athlete to. Depends what sport we're working on, but we can also profile sports to be more strength dominant or more speed dominant, and that will dictate how much Olympic lifting plays a role in those sports. But all in all, this is a nice way to sort of look at the progression and the regression of the application of weightlifting in the training model. Okay, so when we're looking at programming the lifts, we need to ask ourselves first, why do we need them? And what do we need them for? We need to look at the frequency. How many days per week can we fit it in? If we're fitting it on multiple days, are we loading it multiple days? Or are we trying to develop skills? So if we're looking at a developmental focus, it might be every single day. If it's a performance focus, it's a needs dependence. So if we're looking at sort of trying to get some load in there, but also get some running, also get some conditioning, also get some match practice, also get some other strength work in, we're probably looking at once to twice a week, whereas a developmental focus could be as high as 3, 4, even 5 times a week if it's very basic. In terms of intensity and volume, if it's a developmental focus, it's going to be a high volume, low intensity. If it's a performance focus, it's going to be a low volume, high intensity. And that still pertains exactly to the days which I just mentioned. So looking at intensity, this chart is fairly similar to what we'll see for other strength training programs. It's just slightly more specific to weightlifting and what qualities we're developing. So it gives us a nice framework for sort of intensity to work with and what qualities they're going to be developing along the chain. So this is a good resource. What I'll do, guys, is I'll send you the book as well as which this came from. But this is probably a really nice, simple resource to look at just to make sure you're staying within healthy programming parameters when looking at loading the Olympic lifts. And now looking at the volume as well. So we get a nice breakdown, again, more specific to the weightlifting tasks on what qualities we're developing when we're training certain rep ranges. And it also gives us a nice chart to work with in terms of what's the weekly load we should be giving someone who's doing Olympic lifting training. So what we can see with this is if we're training 5 days a week with a developing athlete on the Olympic lifting skill, or 4 days a week, and we're doing 10, 20, 30 reps a session, we can't load that. Because as soon as we load that, we're going to go well out of our volume range. Same thing working with someone who's working with high loads, we have to keep it low. Okay, so developing athletes, high reps means our volume has to be low to stay in ranges. Developed athletes or skilled athletes who are working with high loads already have to do very minimal amounts because they're going to start having a training influence on that. In a negative sense. There are some alternate methods. So like I was discussing with the force velocity curve, sometimes the barbell is not always the best tool. So dumbbell and kettlebell regression, such as the kettlebell clean and jerk or the dumbbell snatch, are great patterning tools to get athletes used to working with loads fast. And it's a nice way to transition out of basic strength training modalities. It also has a nice element, especially kettlebell work, on building some robustness and body contact and just being comfortable moving weights in an efficient manner. We can use medicine balls as well. This is more of a speed strength tool or a speed tool, but we're still focusing on similar movement pattern direction. So looking at that vertical pattern of movement. We can use our Dow stick. So this is where the developing athlete would come in really handy, where we're doing that high rep work so we can unload the movement and practice the skill over and over again. So that's when you can play around with your high rep work. We can use variants, so the high pulls, the floor pulls, shrugs, etc. And this will come down to a needs basis. So we don't always need to do the full movement. And also looking at weighted jumps as well. So this is going to be a supplementary tool. If we're unable to get people with proficiency with Olympic lifting, we can look at building their tolerance up to handling weighted jumps and stuff, which is a slightly less complicated motor skill. You lose elements of the qualities which I was talking about the high coordination, the high strength and stability and mobility that we get from Olympic lifting. You might lose that in the weighted jumps, but you're still able to get those power, speed qualities developed. Just to wrap things up, guys, and as I said, we'll break this down more going forward, but what I want you to take away from this is that Olympic weightlifting is a tool in a toolkit. It should be used as required, okay? So if you resonate well with Olympic weightlifting and you're confident coaching and stuff, that's great, but understand how relevant it is to your athlete, how important is this tool in their athletic development box. And that's really important, is that we understand what it is, what it does, and how it helps athletic qualities, and use it as required. We can't necessarily make it that it's a necessity for everyone. It's always going to be a case-by-case situation. The cleans develop more power and strength speed due to the loading and the execution. So generally cleans are loaded with heavier weights, especially in developmental athletes. They'll be able to load the clean faster than the snatch. So it's great for developing more power, strength, speed, whereas the snatch focuses more developing power and speed strength. So the other side of that, due to its greater range of motion, there's a greater period to accelerate through. And as I mentioned earlier, they're working with lighter loads, so that bar naturally is going to accelerate faster. And finally, the variance can be as effective, if not more, depending on the athlete's skill level, orthopedic makeup, environment, and sports demand. And so it's really important that not only when we're teaching these movements, we're understanding where our athlete's coming from, where they're going to, those basic principles I talked about the other week. What is the demand? What is the need? Does the environment allow us to teach us this? And all the common questions we have to ask whenever we're applying any skill is how appropriate is it for this athlete in this scenario? If you're able to take something from these, hopefully that helps create some framework and context about how Olympic weightlifting relates to sports performance. I'll look forward to taking you guys through a little bit further in depth as we move into more discussion and practical sides later in the week.